Alright, this is Module 6, Part 2 in our unit on Judaism. And in this video, we're going to take a look at the Jewish scriptures, and then I'll say a little bit about the sects of Judaism. Now, you have lots of materials. You have the text that talks quite a bit about both of these topics, the scriptures and the sects. Plus, I will provide for you a nice introduction and summary to the Jewish scriptures, and also some samples, which of course you probably have if you own a Bible. So here I'm just going to try to keep it short and just hit the highlights. Well, the biblical text, and here we're focusing on what is properly called the Tanakh. Christians refer to it as the Old Testament, but that is frankly somewhat demeaning. To Jews, as you might imagine, there's nothing old about their testament. According to Jews, it's their primary religious scripture, which greatly predates the New Testament of Christianity. Anyway, the term Tanakh, it's an acronym that is formed from combining the sounds of the first letters of the three basic parts of the Tanakh, or the Hebrew scriptures. The first part is the Torah, which means something like teaching or the law. The second part is in Hebrew referred to as Nevi'im, and that refers to the prophets. And then the third part of the Hebrew scriptures is referred to as the Ketuvim, or various writings. And so we take the first sounds of those three words, the T sound, the N sound, the K sound, and you insert vowels, and we get Tanakh, which is the proper term. And I've just actually laid out the basic structure of the Hebrew scriptures. There are three basic parts: the Torah, which includes what is called the Pentateuch, Penta being a prefix for five, the first five books of the Hebrew scriptures, the Torah. And then the other part of the Hebrew scriptures is comprised of prophets, both so-called former and latter prophets. And then finally there's various writings like Psalms, Ecclesiastes, Proverbs, and things like that, which is just a diverse collection of various writings. So that's the three basic parts of the Hebrew scriptures. It was written sometime during the time period between about 1100 BCE to about 200 BCE. So roughly about a 900-year time period, all of course predating Jesus. And let me make a point here. We must remember that the Hebrew scriptures were the scriptures of Jesus. Jesus was Jewish. He was born into a Jewish world to Jewish parents. All of his apostles were Jewish. In fact, there was no Christianity during the time of Christ. I hope that should be clear to most of you. So he was very much a Jew, and when he quoted scriptures, he quoted the Tanakh, because that was his scriptures. And he was quite serious about the Tanakh. And I'll read a passage for you from Matthew. Now, this is the New Testament. Matthew chapter 5, verses 17 through 20. And here Jesus makes it quite clear that the Hebrew scriptures are paramount and important. When he uses the term law here, it's a capital L, scholars generally understand that to refer to the Pentateuch. Some people add the prophets, the Pentateuch plus the prophets to that. Anyway, here's what Jesus has to say about the Hebrew scriptures. Do not suppose that I have come to abolish the law, the Hebrew scriptures, and the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to complete. I tell you this, so long as heaven and earth endure, not a letter, not a stroke will disappear from the law until all that must happen has happened. If any man therefore sets aside even the least of the law's demands. Again, that's a capital L referring to the Pentateuch. and teaches others to do the same, he will have the lowest place in the kingdom of heaven, whereas anyone who keeps the law and teaches others so will stand high in the kingdom of heaven. And so perhaps that's the reason why early Christians, when they were sort of cobbling together what would eventually become known as the Bible, were adamant about including the Hebrew Scriptures in the Bible. There were some Christian groups, for example, the Marcionites, who advocated against that, who did not want to include any of the Hebrew Scriptures. But they did not win that argument, obviously. Okay, well, so there's a connection anyway between Judaism and Christianity. As far as the texts themselves, like all other Middle Eastern ancient literature, they formed out of stories and tales, mythology, if you will, used in its technically proper sense, that had been around for ages, probably passed down orally, and eventually written down. One can find quite a bit from the literature of ancient Sumeria, ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt in the Hebrew Scriptures. Quite a bit, quite a few parts of, for example, the flood story, the Tower of Babel, the Genesis creation accounts. A lot of this can be traced back to older traditions. So I'll give you an example. In chapter 1, verse 2 of Genesis, the word Tehom, T-E-H-O-M, in Hebrew is used, and it refers to the primordial waters that Elohim, in this case, that was the name for God used in the first Genesis account, actually whipped into shape, so to speak, brought order out of chaos, and this chaos was referred to as Tehom. Well, it's been pointed out that in the Babylonian creation epic, the Enuma Elish, written probably some 400 to 700 years or so before the earliest writing of the Hebrew Scriptures, talks about a god named Marduk who slays Tiamat, a goddess that represents chaos. And it's been noted by quite a few scholars that Tehom is an obvious derivative of the earlier Tiamat. So that would be one specific connection to earlier literature, and there are others. So anyway, so the earliest writings begin about 1100 BCE, as I mentioned earlier, and I've covered some of this material in Module 6, Part 1. But basically, it does appear as though it was the priestly writers during the time of the Babylonian exile, which began in 586 BCE, that really sort of began to redact and basically cobble together all of these various writings to give us the version that we see today. Now, as it turns out, though, the version that we have today would not actually be confirmed, so to speak, or totally agreed upon until about 90 CE. In other words, about 60 years or so after Jesus had come and gone. So it took them some time before they actually decided upon one version. Now today, as we trace backwards, it gets really, really difficult, really problematic to basically confirm and verify that what we're reading actually was in the original text. We have none of the original manuscripts. We have some very old pieces of early manuscripts, a few bits and pieces from the Dead Sea Scrolls, for example. Also, too, in the documentary you're going to watch, there's another scroll that dates back, a little tiny scroll that dates back to about 700 BCE. But generally speaking, it's a very problematic task to actually find some connection between what we read today and what actually probably existed, let's say, right after the time of the Babylonian exile. Just to give you an example of some of the problems in this regard, here's a passage from the Oxford Study edition of the New English Bible. It's quite authoritative, actually. And I'll read you just a passage. In the 2nd century A.D., and they mean C.E., or even earlier, the rabbis compiled a text from such manuscripts as had survived the destruction of Jerusalem in A.D. 70. And on this basis was established a traditional or Masoretic text. This text incorporated the mistakes of generations of copyists, and in spite of the care bestowed on it, many errors of later copyists also found their way into it. So much for the text of the Hebrew Old Testament as it lies before us, but it is certain that this does not always represent what was originally written. The translator must often go behind the traditional text to discover the writer's meaning, and for this purpose he may have recourse first to the scrolls, but these cover only a very small part of the writings of the Tanakh. Secondly, he may have recourse to the Samaritan Pentateuch, which, though extant only in late manuscripts, the earliest being dated to about the 11th century CE, may be somewhat earlier than the scrolls and represents the text of the 5 books of the law. It differs from the traditional Hebrew text in a considerable number of small and mostly unimportant points. For further help, the translator may turn to the ancient versions. Of these, the earliest is the Old Testament in Greek, designed to meet the needs of Greek-speaking Jews in Egypt in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE. According to tradition, the Pentateuch was translated by 72 elders, 6 from each of the 12 tribes of Israel, so that the Greek version of the Tanakh came to be called the Septuagint, from the Latin Septuaginta, or 70. Clearly, it is the work of a number of translators of unequal skill. Their rendering is now literal, now paraphrastic, and now interpret. In other words, it's sometimes literal, sometimes they paraphrase, sometimes they interpret. Not infrequently, it contains mistranslations. Anyway, of course, the problem, in simple terms, is simply that we do not have the original manuscripts from which the versions we're reading today were produced. In regard to the sects of Judaism, there are lots of different denominations, I guess we would call them, in Judaism, but there are probably 3 primary sects, as most people would see it. The most conservative sect of Judaism is called the Orthodox sect. And this sect faithfully follows the Torah, rejects any attempt to modernize or alter traditional beliefs, and in general just attempts to be faithful to the original writings. In fact, many Orthodox rabbis don't even accept converts to other Jewish sects. They're a very powerful force in Israel, where I guess the most radical amongst them are actually sometimes referred to as the ultra-Orthodox. In fact, in Israel, Orthodox rabbis do not even recognize the authority of rabbis that are not Orthodox. Secondly, we have the conservative sect, which is ironically not quite as quote-unquote conservative or orthodox as the Orthodox sect. This branch of Judaism is dedicated to many of the traditional beliefs and practices of Judaism, but they will also change Judaism to stay abreast of changing culture. So, for example, they accept women into rabbinical studies programs, and clearly they accept women as rabbis. And many Americans, not most, but many American Jews belong to the conservative sect. And then finally, the most popular sect, at least here in the States for Jews, is called the Reform sect. And this is the most liberal Jewish sect. In this case, Judaism is considered to be a dynamic, ever-changing, evolving religion rather than a static religion that was defined once and for all in the Hebrew Scriptures. And in fact, they attempt to make Judaism a universal religion that will appeal to modern taste everywhere. And they're certainly not averse to changing liturgy, changing styles of worship, and so forth. And as I said, most Americans actually belong to the Reform sect.